We're joined now by Bob Seeley, Conservative MP, Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Russia and a member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, also a former soldier. Thank you for being with us. So I just wonder what you made of last night. I mean, right there was a moment when a very nasty and deadly conflict could have become something altogether more dangerous and ominous through, a mistake or a miscalculation or even a rushed response. How do you see it?
Well, thankfully, we didn't have a rush response, Mark, and clearly wise heads prevailed. There was never, look, it was always going to be an accident. The idea that the Russians would just lob a missile over some kind of provocation without thinking it through, although the Russians do provocations, this just looked from the word go like it was either a Ukrainian missile or a Russian missile that had gone astray. The important thing, Mark, is that we know that the Russian policy, the Russian strategy in Ukraine going forward consists of two elements. Firstly, to hold a defensible line. That's why they're withdrawn from Kherson. And secondly, to destroy Ukrainian infrastructure because the Ukrainians do not yet have enough air defense kit.
You see, President Zelensky of Ukraine is still being reported today, I see, as saying that he's convinced it is a Russian missile.
Yeah, I mean, it almost certainly wasn't, but if it was an accidental hit. For me, when it happened, the only thing that I was thinking is that the Russians haven't been able to attack those supply routes into the country, into Ukraine from Poland. And was this an attempt to put a marker down or to attack one of those supply routes? But that was the only element of this that I think was potentially dangerous, because that would have been an escalation. But I think one shouldn't get too focused on this, because clearly this is not in itself going to change the nature of the war. What is changing the nature of the war was the 100 missile attacks on electricity and water supply. And the Ukrainians, Mark, are now in an invidious sort of catch-22 position. Do they defend their population in the cities with the air defense kit they've got, or do they defend their electricity and water supplies? So are they going to try to stop Russia killing civilians with direct attacks on civilian areas, or are they going to try to save their civilian population by stopping people freezing to death this winter? Well, and the answer is we need to give them more air defense kit.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because the tragedy in Poland, and it was a tragedy because two people lost their lives, did deflect as you say, from another barbaric and cynical assault on the infrastructure in Ukraine.
It did, and one should be under no illusions about the potential dangers here of escalation. Global conflicts start because with two ingredients. Firstly, you have underlying tensions and rivalries, whether that's in Ukraine or whether it's in Taiwan. And after that, you then have miscalculations, as Hitler in 1939, or you have random events that spiral out of control, as in the events that led up to the beginning of World War I. So one shouldn't write these sort of random events off because they are potentially dangerous, because they can lead to rash decision-making. That's why we have very, very clear red lines about what we are willing and not willing to do. And thus far, we have stuck to those red lines, which is very important. The Russians are now trying to escalate, but they're escalating within Ukraine. Despite blowing up Nord Stream, their own pipelines, in order to threaten us, they haven't, I don't think, yet hit Western infrastructure, although there was damage to an internet cable in between Shetland and the top of Scotland. So I just wonder if that is something that was sending a message, the Russians sending a message.
So this is interesting. Do you think then that it is the case that the longer this conflict goes on, and in a sense, the better Ukraine does in this conflict, that the more likely it is that some miscalculation or some event, as you were just describing there, does take us into, unthinkable territory?
Yes, completely. And that is the problem. And that's the horrible catch in this war. The better the Ukrainians do, the more pressure that Putin will be on to escalate. So people are saying that the loss of Kherson mark is a new phase in the war. It isn't. It's actually the Russians drawing back to defensible lines, because now the Ukrainians, anywhere between Zaporozhye and the Black Sea, the Ukrainians are going to have to cross the Dnieper. That is a massive exercise. It's 10 kilometers wide at some places. You simply can't do it. So the Russians have actually got themselves behind these lines. But the next phase of the war starts with the Ukrainian advances on Russian positions, either in the east in Donbass or in the south. And when the Ukrainians break that Russian land corridor between Crimea and the Donbass, you're going to have some pretty big calls that Putin is then going to be making. Does he escalate? Does he use chemical weapons like in Syria? Does he try to use nukes? Does he try to blow up the Zaporozhye power station? Does he accept that this war is then going to be in an end game where Russia faces defeat in the field? And thus far, Putin has always chosen to escalate. And thus far, every time somebody citing conventional wisdom in the West says, surely Putin wouldn't do that, would he? He does.
But despite that, is it your view that, you know, while the Russians are on the back foot on the battlefield, should the West maintain or even increase military help to Ukraine?
I think so, yes. Although clearly there are risks. I've just been at an event to celebrate the Magnitsky Awards that are taking place tonight. The Magnitsky Acts were brought in to be able to punish people, human rights abusers worldwide, following the murder of the Russian lawyer Sergei Magnitsky. That was Bill Browder's campaign for much of the last decade. And what is quite clear is that we should be supporting the Ukrainians more. And there's one thing specifically that the Ukrainians for months have said that they don't have enough of. And in fact, two of the Ukrainians at the event I've just been to were talking about this. We don't have enough. We haven't given the Ukrainians enough air defense kit. And so the Ukrainians are crying out for air defense kit for tanks and for planes. Planes and tanks, you can talk about what the real need is there. But air defense, we need to give them more air defense so they don't have to make a choice between protecting schools and civilian populations and protecting electricity supply. And that is the fundamental problem. Now, the Russians know that we're giving enough to keep the Ukrainians in the game, but not giving them enough to defeat the Russian armies in the field. And air defense now becomes a critical factor for this winter.
Yeah, but this all now then begs a question: if the Ukrainians continue to do well on the battlefield, the West continue to get this kit through to the Ukrainians, and that question is, what does victory look like? And what does victory look like to the Ukrainians and to the West? And is that different?
It might be different. Again, a very good question. Victory for the Ukrainians is getting their entire country back according to the 1991 borders. So getting all the bits of Donbass and around Donetsk and Lugansk that the Russians seized in 2014 and getting the Crimea back. That is victory to Ukraine. If the defeat and the seizure of Crimea by Ukraine sparks a tactical nuclear response, that may not start looking like victory either for the Ukraine, but it certainly won't look like victory for us in this country if there is a nuclear response and if there's an escalation to some sort of nuclear catastrophe. So I think probably in the West, what victory looks like is the beginnings of the collapse of Russian positions in the spring, and from that point a negotiated settlement. That maybe is what a lot of Western states would want. However, once the Ukrainians start winning in the field, they are not going to turn around and say we're going to hold back. They will want to prosecute this war till its physical battlefield end.
Yeah, because what President Zelensky would have taken in the early stages of this war, he may well not want to take now, because his military is doing very well, it seems.
Yeah. Absolutely. And Mark, again, you have to deal with public perceptions in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are in no mood to negotiate with Russia. They want the defeat of Russian armies in the field. They want the reoccupation or the deoccupation of all of the area around the Sea of Azov, the Donbass and the Crimea. And that is what victory looks like to them. And if Zelensky starts getting soft on that, he will face some pressure within his own country, despite his very heroic status at the moment. The problem that Zelensky has is that he is financially, and the Ukrainian military has, is that they are entirely or becoming financially dependent on the West, and almost entirely dependent on the West in terms of military supply. So the US but also the United Kingdom, the European Union, Germany, and France to a lesser extent, have a significant amount of clout because the supply of arms could dry up. But again, that will then create pressures between Ukraine and the West, pressures on the battlefield as well. So there are lots of variable factors, but you're absolutely right with the basic rule. The better that the Ukrainians do, the greater the pressure on Putin to do something dramatic and escalatory. There will come a sweet spot whereby the West would probably want Ukraine to start to negotiate. However, the Ukrainians, once they start winning or continue to win on the battlefield, the only thing they're interested in is prosecuting this war and getting their entire country back. So there are potential pressures and decision points along that road for the next 6 months that for sure are potentially going to be very dramatic and potentially very dangerous.
Yeah, well, very interesting. And thank you for coming on, Bob Seeley. Thank you.